The autumn wind rustled through the trees as a teenage girl walked home from her high school debate club practice. She had just finished presenting her argument about environmental protection, earning praise from her teacher and teammates. Her debate team badge gleamed on her backpack as she walked, catching the late afternoon sunlight. The streets were quiet in this suburban neighborhood, with only the occasional car passing by. The girl checked her phone, smiling at a message from her mom, asking if she wanted her favorite pizza for dinner. She texted back a quick yes, followed by 3 heart emojis. Life felt good. She had maintained her position as one of the top students in her class, and her recent volunteer work at the local community center had earned her a special recognition from the city council. As she turned the corner onto Maple Street, just 3 blocks from home, a police cruiser slowly pulled up beside her. Her heart skipped a beat, but she reminded herself there was nothing to worry about. Then another police car appeared from the opposite direction, and before she could process what was happening, 2 officers jumped out, hands on their weapons. "Stop right there. Put your hands where we can see them," one officer shouted, his voice echoing through the peaceful neighborhood. Confused and terrified, the girl froze. Her phone slipped from her trembling hands, clattering onto the sidewalk. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Turn around, face the wall," the second officer commanded, moving closer. Neighbors began emerging from their homes, drawn by the commotion. Mrs. Chen, who had known the girl since she was in elementary school, rushed out of her house with her phone already recording. Other residents followed suit, their faces showing a mix of concern and disbelief. "But I didn't do anything," the girl protested, tears welling up in her eyes. She was wearing her debate team hoodie and carrying a backpack full of schoolbooks. Her hands shook as she raised them above her head. The officers roughly handcuffed her, ignoring her repeated questions about what she had supposedly done wrong. One officer mentioned a robbery at a convenience store, but the girl had been at school all day, surrounded by teachers and classmates. A crowd was gathering now. The local baker, who often gave the girl free cookies when she helped tutor his son in math, stepped forward. "Officers, there must be some mistake. I know this girl, she's an honor student." But the officers weren't listening. They patted her down and began reading her rights, all while body cameras recorded and cell phones filmed from every angle. The girl caught glimpses of familiar faces in the crowd, her neighbor's shocked expression, her friend's mom making a frantic phone call, probably to her parents. The girl's mind raced through the events of her day. The morning chat with her history teacher about college applications, lunch with her friends where they planned their upcoming community service project, the successful debate practice. How had her normal school day turned into this nightmare? As they led her toward the police car, she heard the distant sound of running footsteps. Her mother, still in her doctor's scrubs from her shift at the children's hospital, was sprinting down the street. Her father wasn't far behind, having left a parent-teacher conference the moment he got the call. "That's my daughter," her mother shouted, her voice cracking with emotion. "What are you doing to my baby?" The officers held the parents back, citing protocol and procedure. The girl looked back at her parents, tears now flowing freely down her face. "Mom, Dad, I didn't do anything wrong. I promise." The police car door slammed shut, and through the window, the girl watched her neighborhood, the place where she had grown up, learned to ride her bike, and played with friends, transform into a scene of chaos and confusion. Her father was on the phone, likely calling their family lawyer, while her mother argued with the officers, presenting her daughter's school ID and debate team schedule as proof of her whereabouts. As the police car pulled away, no one knew that this incident would uncover something far more disturbing than a simple case of mistaken identity. The truth that would eventually come to light would shake the entire community to its core and lead to changes that no one could have anticipated on that autumn afternoon. The body camera footage, the neighbors' cell phone videos, and Mrs. Chen's recording would soon tell a story that would spread far beyond their quiet suburban street. But for now, a frightened teenager sat in the back of a police car, her debate team badge still gleaming on the backpack that lay forgotten on the sidewalk, while a community watched in helpless disbelief as one of. The video spread like wildfire across social media. By midnight, millions had watched the teenage honor student being handcuffed outside her own neighborhood. The footage from Mrs. Chen's phone was particularly powerful, showing a young girl in her debate team hoodie, clearly terrified, being arrested while her mother ran toward her in hospital scrubs. Local news vans lined the quiet suburban street the next morning. The family's phone hadn't stopped ringing since the incident. The girl's mother sat at their kitchen table, still in yesterday's scrubs, making call after call to everyone who might help: their family lawyer, civil rights organizations, community leaders. Her hands shook as she dialed each number, her coffee long gone cold beside her. In the living room, the girl's father paced back and forth, his principal's badge still clipped to his shirt from the day before. He paused occasionally to check his phone, reading messages from concerned teachers and parents from his school. The support was overwhelming, but it didn't ease the knot in his stomach. His daughter, who had spent countless hours helping younger students with their homework, was now sitting in a juvenile detention center. "They won't let us seat her until morning," the mother said, her voice cracking as she hung up another call. "How can they keep our baby overnight for something she didn't do?" The local news was running the story on repeat. Neighbors had provided multiple angles of video footage, each more disturbing than the last. The baker, whose son had improved his grades thanks to the girl's tutoring, appeared in one clip, clearly distressed as he tried to reason with the officers. By dawn, the story had gone national. News anchors debated the incident while showing clips of the girl's recent speech at the city council meeting where she had proposed a youth mentorship program. The contrast between the poised young speaker in that video and the terrified teenager in handcuffs was striking. The police department issued their statement at 9 a.m. A spokesperson stood at a podium, reading from a prepared text. "Our officers responded to a reported robbery at the Quick Stop convenience store. The suspect description matched the individual in question, and officers followed standard protocol in making the arrest. We are reviewing the incident as per department policy." The statement only fueled the community's outrage. Outside the police station, a crowd gathered. Many held signs with photos of the girl receiving academic awards and volunteering at community events. Her debate team showed up in full force, wearing their team hoodies in solidarity. The girl's parents finally got to see her that morning. She sat across from them in the juvenile center's meeting room, still wearing her debate team hoodie from the day before, now wrinkled from sleeping in it. Dark circles under her eyes showed she hadn't slept much. When she saw her parents, she broke down crying. "I kept telling them to check with the school," she sobbed as her mother held her. "My teacher, the debate team, everyone could prove where I was. Why wouldn't they listen?" Her father, usually so composed in his role as a principal, struggled to maintain his calm. "We're going to fix this, sweetheart. The whole community is behind you." Back at that house, support poured in from unexpected places. The girl's chemistry teacher dropped off a week's worth of assignments, not wanting her to fall behind. The debate team captain came by with notes from their latest practice. Even the elderly couple down the street, who usually kept to themselves, brought over a homemade meal for the family. Mrs. Chen had become an unexpected hero in the community. Her clear, steady video of the incident had captured crucial details that the body cameras had missed. She sat with the family that afternoon, sharing details she had noticed. "The officers didn't even check her student ID," she said, her voice trembling with anger. "They wouldn't listen to any of us." The convenience store owner, whose shop had allegedly been robbed, came forward with his own statement. He appeared nervous on camera, fidgeting with his glasses as he spoke to reporters. The robbery suspect was described as being much taller, he admitted. And the timing, it doesn't match up with when this young lady was arrested. As evening approached, the family's lawyer arrived with news. The body camera footage had revealed concerning inconsistencies in the officers' accounts. Something about the original robbery report didn't add up. But more importantly, he had filed motions to have all charges dropped immediately. The girl sat quietly on their living room couch, wrapped in a blanket her grandmother had made, watching the coverage of her own story unfold on television. Her phone buzzed constantly with supportive messages from classmates and teachers, but she couldn't bring herself to reply yet. The thought of returning to school, of everyone knowing what had happened, filled her with anxiety. Her mother sat beside her, running her fingers through her daughter's hair like she used to do when she was little. "You did nothing wrong," she whispered, "and we're going to make sure everyone knows that." Outside their home, the media trucks continued their vigil. But beyond them, neighbors had gathered on the sidewalk, holding a quiet candlelight demonstration of support. The debate team, the baker and his son, Mrs. Chen, teachers, classmates, the whole community stood together, their lights twinkling in the growing darkness. What no one knew yet was that this incident would unravel something much bigger than a case of mistaken identity. The truth lurking beneath the surface would shock everyone, but that revelation was still to come. For now, a family huddled together in their living room, surrounded by their community's love, waiting for justice to finally prevail. Inside the Internal Affairs office, a veteran detective sat at her desk, surrounded by stacks of files and 3 computer monitors. She'd been up since dawn, reviewing body camera footage for the 5th time. Something about this case didn't sit right with her, and she was determined to find out why. Her colleagues called her the Bloodhound because once she caught the scent of something wrong, she never let go. 20 years on the force had taught her to trust her instincts, and right now, those instincts were screaming that there was more to this story than a simple case of mistaken identity. She pulled up the convenience store's robbery report again, comparing timestamps with the girl's arrest. The numbers didn't add up. According to the store's security logs, someone had accessed the back office computer just minutes before the robbery was reported. Yet the official police report made no mention of this detail. Her phone buzzed, another message from her daughter. "Mom, did you see the new video? The girl who got arrested, she tutored me in math last semester. She's the sweetest person ever." The detective leaned back in her chair, rubbing her tired eyes. This case had become personal for everyone in town. She thought about her own daughter, how easily this could have happened to her. With renewed determination, she dove back into the files. Across town, the young girl sat in her bedroom, staring at her debate team uniform hanging on the closet door. She hadn't been back to school since the incident. The thought of walking those hallways, feeling everyone's eyes on her, made her stomach churn. Her phone chimed with another message from her debate team. They were preparing for the state championships, but had refused to compete without her. "We're a family," the team captain had insisted. "We stand together or not at all." A gentle knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. Her father stood there, still in his principal's suit, but with his tie loosened. "Hey, sweetheart, your mom and I just got a call from Internal Affairs. They want to interview you again, but this time it's different. There's a detective who thinks she's found something important." The next morning, the detective's office felt different from the cold interrogation room where the girl had first been questioned. Warm sunlight streamed through the windows, and family photos dotted the detective's desk. The detective herself had a kind face with laugh lines around her eyes, though right now those eyes were focused intently on her computer screen. "Let's go through this one more time," the detective said gently. "But today, I want to focus on something specific, the timing. You mentioned your debate practice ended at 4:30, correct?" The girl nodded, her mother's hand squeezing her shoulder supportively. "And according to your phone records, you texted your mom about pizza at 4:43. The detective pulled up a map on her screen. "That means you physically couldn't have been at the convenience store when the robbery was reported at 4:35. The girl's father leaned forward. "What are you saying?" The detective's eyes narrowed as she pulled up another document. "I'm saying that someone wanted us to arrest your daughter. The question is why." As she spoke, her computer pinged with a new email. Security footage from a traffic camera near the convenience store had finally arrived. The detective opened the file, and the room fell silent as they watched. The timestamp read 4:35 p.m., the exact time of the reported robbery. The store looked completely normal. No signs of disturbance, no panic, no robbery. "But that's impossible," the girl's mother whispered. "If there was no robbery, why did someone call it in?" The detective pulled out a thick file. "That's not the only strange thing. One of the officers who arrested your daughter had 3 similar incidents in the past year, all involving young people of color, all near that same convenience store. All the charges were eventually dropped, but the paperwork was buried so deep it took me days to find it." She spread photographs across her desk. Other young people, other wrongful arrests, other buried stories. A pattern was emerging, like pieces of a puzzle slowly coming together. The girl stared at the photos, her hands trembling slightly. "I recognize some of these people," she said quietly. "They'd all volunteered at the community center, just like me." The detective's eyes lit up. The community center? The one next to the convenience store? A knock on the office door interrupted them. Another detective poked his head in, holding a file. "You need to see this," he said urgently. "We found something in the convenience store's financial records." The girl and her parents watched as the two detectives huddled over the new documents, their expressions growing more serious by the second. Finally, the lead detective turned back to them, her face grim but determined. "What started as a wrongful arrest investigation just became something much bigger," she said. "Someone's been using these false police reports to cover up other crimes, and your daughter's arrest might have just helped us crack it wide open." The girl felt a mix of emotions, fear, anger, but also a growing sense of purpose. Her voice shook slightly as she asked, "What can I do to help?" The detective smiled warmly. "You've already done the most important part. You stayed strong and spoke up. Now it's our turn to do our jobs." She turned to the girl's parents. "But I want you to be prepared. What we're uncovering here, it's going to shake this department to its core." As they left the office that afternoon, the girl noticed something different in her reflection in the elevator doors. The fear was still there, but something else had taken root: determination. She might have been wrongly arrested, but now she was part of uncovering the truth. Back in her office, the detective pinned a new photo to her investigation board, the convenience store owner's business license. Next to it, she placed a list of officers with questionable arrest records. Then, slowly, she began connecting them with red string, creating a web of connections that would soon expose a truth no one had expected to find. Rain pattered against the windows of the Internal Affairs office as the detective spread out dozens of security camera stills across her desk. Each image told a piece of the story, but it wasn't until she laid them all out in chronological order that the truth began to emerge. The convenience store's cameras had captured more than just the absence of a robbery. In the footage from that afternoon, a store employee could be seen entering numbers into the back office computer just minutes before the false robbery report was called in. The same employee appeared in footage from other days when similar false reports had been made. The detective's phone lit up with a text from the forensics team. "Found something on the burner phone. You need to see this now." Across town, the young girl sat in her family's living room, surrounded by support letters from her community. The debate team had dropped by earlier, bringing her favorite snacks and updates about their upcoming competition. But her mind kept drifting back to the investigation. "Honey," her mother called from the kitchen, "the detective is on her way over. She says she's made a breakthrough." Within the hour, their living room had turned into an impromptu investigation headquarters. The detective laid out documents on their coffee table while the girl's parents listened intently. The television hummed quietly in the background, showing yet another news report about the case. "Look at these timestamps," the detective pointed to a series of photographs. The employee enters the back office at 4:28. At 4:32, they make a phone call. At 4:35, the robbery is reported. But here's where it gets interesting. She pulled out another set of images. This pattern repeats on 6 different dates over the past year. The girl leaned forward, studying the images. "That's the same day my friend from the community center was arrested," she said, pointing to one date. "And this one, that's when they arrested the basketball team captain." The detective nodded grimly. "Exactly. But it goes deeper than that." She pulled out financial records from the store. Every time there's a false robbery report, there's also an inventory adjustment in the store's system, small amounts of cash and merchandise written off as stolen. The girl's father, using his principal's analytical mind, started connecting the dots. So they steal in from the store themselves and using false police reports to cover it up. "Yes, but that's not even the worst part," the detective replied, pulling out more documents. "Remember the officer who made your daughter's arrest? We found bank records showing regular payments to him from an offshore account. The same account that traces back to a shell company owned by the store's regional manager." The girl's mother gasped. "They were working together? The police and the store?" The detective nodded. A small group of corrupt officers were being paid to make these arrests. They deliberately targeted young people from the community center, people they thought wouldn't have the resources or support to fight back. The girl felt her hands trembling as realization dawned. All those other kids who were arrested, they were just like me. Wrong place, wrong time, but perfect for their plan. Just then, the detective's phone buzzed. The forensics team had cracked the encryption on text messages from the burner phone. The messages revealed a carefully orchestrated scheme. The store employee would stage false robberies, the corrupt officers would make wrongful arrests, and everyone involved would get a cut of the stolen money. The girl's arrest had been different, though. The employee had panicked that day, calling in a false report earlier than usual because they'd noticed someone watching them suspiciously. They hadn't expected to catch the daughter of a doctor and a principal, someone with the resources and community support to fight back. Your arrest was their mistake, the detective explained. They usually targeted kids who felt they had no choice but to accept a plea deal. But you and your family stood your ground. You made noise. You got people asking questions. The girls' debate team training kicked in as she processed this information. So what happens now? The detective smiled grimly. Now we have enough evidence for search warrants. Tomorrow morning, we're going to raid the store's regional office and collect all their computers. We're also bringing in the officers involved for questioning. As if on cue, her phone buzzed again. The forensics team had found something else. Emails discussing plans to expand the scheme to other stores in the chain. The girl's father stood up, his voice firm. This needs to go public, not just for our daughter, but for all the other kids they targeted. The detective agreed. We're planning to hold a press conference tomorrow afternoon. But first, she turned to the girl. I want to ask you something. Would you be willing to speak at the conference? Your story could help us reach other victims who might be afraid to come forward. The girl looked at her parents, then back at the detective. The fear she'd felt during her arrest was still there, but now it was overshadowed by something stronger, a desire for justice. Yes, she said firmly. I'll do it. Those officers thought they could silence us because we're young. They thought nobody would listen to us or believe us. It's time to prove them wrong. As the detective gathered her documents to leave, thunder rumbled outside. The storm that had been threatening all day was finally breaking. But inside the house, the atmosphere had changed. What had started as a wrongful arrest had uncovered a conspiracy that would shake the entire police department and community. The girl stood at her window, watching the rain fall. Tomorrow, the truth would come out. Tomorrow, things would finally start to change. But tonight, she had one more thing to do. She picked up her phone and started typing a message to all the other young people who'd been wrongly arrested. The truth is finally coming out. You're not alone. And we're going to make sure this never happens to anyone else. Dawn broke over the city as police vehicles surrounded the convenience store chain's regional office. The detective stood with her team, watching as officers in tactical gear approached the building. Inside, computers held evidence of years of corruption that had ruined countless young lives. Meanwhile, at the girl's house, her family gathered around the television. Breaking news banners flashed across the screen as reporters covered the raids happening simultaneously across the city. The girl sat between her parents, clutching the speech she had written for the upcoming press conference. In 30 minutes, the reporter announced, Internal Affairs will hold a press conference revealing what they're calling a systematic abuse of power targeting young people in our community. The girl's phone buzzed continuously with messages from other victims who had seen the news. Many were speaking up for the first time, sharing stories that matched her own experience, wrong place, wrong time, forced to accept plea deals they didn't deserve. At police headquarters, the detective stood in an interview room, facing one of the arrested officers. His arrogance had melted away as she laid out the evidence before him: bank statements, text messages, security footage, and dozens of wrongful arrest reports. We have the store's financial records, she said, her voice steady. Every false robbery report corresponds with inventory adjustments. Money and merchandise disappeared, written off as stolen goods. But the real theft was happening inside the store. The officer's lawyer shifted uncomfortably as more evidence emerged. The store employee who had been orchestrating the thefts broke down during questioning in another room. He revealed how the scheme had started small, just a few $100s here and there, covered up by false robbery reports. But then they discovered how easy it was to make the charges stick against young people from the community center. The corrupt officers would make arrests based on vague descriptions, knowing their targets often couldn't afford good lawyers. The store employee would get rid of evidence by adjusting inventory records, and everyone involved got a cut of the stolen money. Back at the girl's house, her debate team arrived to support her before the press conference. They helped her practice her speech, offering encouragement and suggestions. Her voice grew stronger with each rehearsal. Remember, her debate coach said gently, "Your words today will give courage to others who are still afraid to come forward." At the convenience store, forensics teams discovered hidden cameras in the back office. These cameras, installed by the corrupt regional manager, had been used to blackmail employees into participating in the scheme. Those who refused found themselves facing false accusations or worse. The detective's phone rang, another break in the case. The forensics team had cracked encrypted files on the regional manager's computer. The files revealed a second scheme. The manager had been selling information about delivery schedules to local thieves, allowing them to hijack shipments. The false robbery reports provided perfect cover for the missing inventory. As the morning progressed, more store employees came forward. Some had suspected something was wrong, but had been too afraid to speak up. Others had tried to report the corruption, but had been silenced by threats or bribes. The girl arrived at police headquarters for the press conference, her parents and debate team by her side. In the conference room, she saw familiar faces, other young people who had been wrongly arrested, now ready to tell their stories. The detective met them in a side room before the press conference began. "What we've uncovered goes beyond a few corrupt officers," she explained. "This was a systematic abuse of power that targeted young people who they thought wouldn't fight back. But they didn't count on your courage." Television cameras rolled as the police chief stepped up to the podium. He outlined the investigation's findings: multiple corrupt officers, store employees involved in theft, a regional manager orchestrating everything, and dozens of innocent young people wrongly arrested to cover it all up. Then came the moment the girl had been preparing for. She walked to the podium, her head held high. The room fell silent as she began to speak. "I stand here today not just for myself, but for every young person who was wrongly arrested, who felt powerless, who was forced to accept punishment for crimes they didn't commit. We were targeted because they thought we were vulnerable. They thought we wouldn't fight back. They were wrong." Her voice grew stronger as she continued. "Today, we're not just exposing corruption. We're exposing a system that allowed powerful people to prey on those they saw as powerless. But we are not powerless. We never were. And by standing together, by speaking up, we're making sure this never happens to anyone else." As she spoke, more evidence was being uncovered across the city. The regional manager's computer contained emails discussing plans to expand the scheme to other store locations. The corrupt officers' phones revealed similar operations at other businesses. What had started as an investigation into one wrongful arrest had exposed a network of corruption that had been growing for years. Back at the convenience store, employees watched the press conference on their phones. Many were crying, finally understanding the full scope of what had been happening around them. The store's honest employees, who had suspected something was wrong but felt helpless to stop it, felt vindicated. The detective watched from the side of the conference room, thinking about her own daughter. The case had started with one wrongful arrest, but it had revealed something much darker: a system that had failed to protect its most vulnerable members. But today, watching these young people speak truth to power, she saw hope for real change. As the press conference ended, the girls' debate team surrounded her with hugs and tears. But there was something different in their eyes now, not just support for their friend, but determination. They had all seen how speaking up could expose truth and bring justice. Outside police headquarters, more young people gathered, holding signs with messages of support. Many were former victims of the scheme, no longer afraid to show their faces or tell their stories. What had started as one girl's fight for justice had become a movement for change. The city council chamber was packed to capacity. Every seat was filled, and people lined the walls, many wearing blue ribbons, a symbol of support for the wrongfully arrested youth. The girl sat with her parents in the front row, her debate team behind her, as the police chief approached the podium. "Today marks a turning point," the chief began, his voice heavy with emotion. "We're here not just to acknowledge wrongdoing, but to take concrete steps toward real change." The meeting had been called to address the scandal that had rocked the community. On the agenda, major reforms to arrest procedures, new oversight measures, and compensation for those wrongfully arrested. But the girl and her family had pushed for something more. systematic changes that would prevent similar abuses from happening again. In the weeks since the truth had emerged, more victims had come forward. The detectives' investigation had revealed over 50 cases of wrongful arrests connected to the corrupt scheme. Each story was different, but they shared a common thread: young people targeted because they seemed vulnerable. The girl's father stood to address the council. As a school principal, his voice carried weight. "My daughter was lucky," he said. "She had resources, support, a community that stood behind her. But what about the kids who didn't? How many lives were damaged because we failed to see what was happening?" His words hung heavy in the air as he outlined their proposals. They weren't just asking for policy changes. They wanted a complete overhaul of how the police department interacted with young people. The detective took the podium next, presenting her findings. The evidence was overwhelming: fake robbery reports, falsified police statements, bank records showing payments to corrupt officers. But more shocking were the personal stories: young people forced to accept plea deals, their futures damaged by false charges. "We found that 85% of these wrongful arrests targeted young people from the community center," she explained. "They chose their victims carefully, betting that these kids wouldn't have the means to fight back." The corrupt officers had already been suspended pending criminal charges. The store's regional manager and involved employees were facing multiple counts of theft, fraud, and conspiracy. But prosecution wasn't enough. The system itself needed to change. The girl watched as city council members reviewed the proposed reforms. New verification procedures before any arrest could be made. Body camera footage to be reviewed by an independent civilian board. A youth advocacy office where young people could safely report police misconduct. Her mother, still in her hospital scrubs after her shift, stood to speak next. "As a doctor, I've seen how trauma affects young people," she said. "The physical bruises heal, but the emotional scars can last a lifetime. We need to heal not just individuals, but our entire community." The debate team captain raised his hand to speak. "We've started a peer support group," he announced. "Young people who've been through this helping others who are still dealing with the aftermath. Because sometimes the only person who really understands is someone who's been there." More community members stood to share their stories. The baker whose son had been wrongfully arrested 2 years ago. A teacher who had watched her student drop out after a false arrest damaged his confidence. Mrs. Chen, whose video had helped expose the truth, speaking about the importance of citizens watching out for each other. The police chief announced immediate changes. All officers would undergo new training focused on youth interaction. A community oversight board would be established, with young people having a voice in police policies. The department would create a special unit to review past arrests, looking for other possible cases of misconduct. But the most significant change came from an unexpected source. The convenience store chain's corporate office sent a representative to the meeting. They announced the creation of a scholarship fund for youth affected by the scandal and a new partnership with the community center to provide job training and employment opportunities. The girl stood to make her final statement. Her voice was clear and strong, months of debate team training evident in her delivery. "What happened to me was wrong, but some good can come from it. We can use this moment to build something better. Not just new rules, but a new relationship between police and young people. One based on trust, respect, and understanding." As she spoke, she saw faces in the crowd nodding: council members, police officers, community leaders. The changes wouldn't happen overnight, but they were starting today. The council voted unanimously to adopt the proposed reforms. But they went further, establishing a permanent youth advisory committee to work with the police department. The girl would serve as its first chairperson. Outside the chamber, reporters gathered to cover the historic vote. But the real story was happening away from the cameras. Young people who had been afraid to speak up were now sharing their stories. Police officers were sitting down with community members, having honest conversations about trust and accountability. The detective watched it all from the back of the room, thinking about how one wrongful arrest had led to this moment. She saw the girl hugging her debate team, their blue ribbons bright against their team hoodies. These young people hadn't just exposed corruption, they had started a movement for change. As evening fell, the girl stood with her parents on the steps of City Hall. Behind them, people streamed out of the building, many stopping to shake their hands or offer words of support. The first steps toward justice had been taken, but the real work was just beginning. Her mother squeezed her hand. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered. "You didn't just fight for yourself, you fought for everyone." The girl looked out at the gathering dusk, thinking about all the other young people who would benefit from today's changes. The system had tried to silence them, but instead it had given them a voice, and they were going to use that voice to make sure no one else had to go through what they had experienced. 1 year later, the community center buzzed with activity. Young people filled every room, some working on homework, others practicing debate techniques, and a special group meeting in the main hall, the Youth Justice Council, born from the changes that one wrongful arrest had sparked. The girl, now a high school senior, stood at the front of the room, leading a workshop on knowing your rights. Around her sat dozens of teenagers, some taking notes, others sharing their own experiences. On the wall behind her hung a framed news article about the scandal that had changed their community, alongside photos of the reforms it had inspired. "Remember," she said, her voice carrying the confidence that came from turning pain into purpose, "being young doesn't mean being powerless. We have voices, we have rights, and most importantly, we have each other." At the back of the room, the detective watched quietly. She'd become a regular visitor to these sessions, not as a police officer, but as a mentor and supporter. The youth advocacy unit she now led had become a model for other cities, showing how police and young people could work together to build trust. Outside, the convenience store that had once been the center of corruption now operated under new management. Local teenagers worked there after school, part of a youth employment program that gave them job experience and a sense of ownership in their community. The store's windows displayed proud photos of its young employees and their achievements. The girl's parents sat in on today's workshop. Her father, still the high school principal, had implemented similar rights awareness programs in schools across the district. Her mother had started a support group for families dealing with the trauma of wrongful arrests, turning her medical expertise toward healing emotional wounds. "Last year," the girl continued, addressing the room, "I was wrongfully arrested right outside this building. I was scared, angry, and felt completely alone. But that experience taught me something important. When we stand together, when we speak up, we can change things that seem impossible to change." She pointed to a chart showing the impact of their reforms. Wrongful arrests had dropped dramatically. The Civilian Oversight Board, which included young community members, reviewed every arrest involving a minor. Body camera footage was automatically reviewed for any stop involving young people. But the numbers told only part of the story. The real change could be seen in the faces around the room. A young athlete who had once been afraid to walk home from practice now led evening safety walks. A quiet artist whose wrongful arrest had nearly derailed her college dreams was now heading to art school on a full scholarship. The baker's son, once too traumatized to speak about his experience, now taught other kids about their rights. The debate team captain, now in college, had returned for today's session. "When we started this," he said, standing to address the group, "people said we were too young to understand, too young to make a difference. Look at us now." He gestured to the wall of achievements, newspaper clippings about their reforms, awards for community service, letters of support from other cities looking to implement similar programs. But more meaningful were the personal victories, young people regaining their confidence, healing their trauma, finding their voices. The detective stepped forward to share some news. "The last of the corrupt officers was sentenced yesterday," she announced. "But more importantly, our new youth training program for police officers starts next week. And guess who's helping to teach it?" The girl smiled, thinking about how far they'd come. She would be part of the team training new officers, sharing her story, and helping them understand the impact their actions could have on young lives. Mrs. Chen arrived with her famous homemade cookies, just as she had done on that first difficult day. But now, instead of bringing comfort to a family in crisis, she was celebrating their success. Her video of the wrongful arrest had done more than expose corruption. It had shown the power of community members looking out for each other. After the workshop, the girl walked through the community center's halls, remembering how different things had felt a year ago. The fear was gone, replaced by determination. The anger had transformed into purpose, and the loneliness had given way to a sense of community stronger than she'd ever imagined possible. In the center's lobby, a new mural stretched across the wall, painted by young artists from the community. It showed hands of different colors joined together, lifting each other up. Beneath it, words written in bold letters. Our voice, our power, our future. The girl's phone buzzed with a message. Another city wanted her to speak about their reforms. The changes they'd fought for were spreading, inspiring others to examine their own systems and make similar improvements. As the sun set outside, casting long shadows through the community center's windows, the girl gathered with her family, friends, and supporters. They had turned a moment of injustice into a movement for change. But more importantly, they had shown that no one had to face injustice alone. Sometimes, she told the group as they prepared to leave, the worst things that happen to us lead to the most important changes. Not just in laws or policies, but in how we see ourselves and each other. She looked around at the faces of people who had become more than supporters. They were partners in creating change. The debate team members who had stood by her. The detective who had uncovered the truth. Mrs. Chen and her unwavering support. Her parents who had turned their pain into action. And all the young people who had found their voices along the way. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to make things better. But tonight, standing in the community center where it all began, they celebrated how far they'd come and the path they had created for others to follow. The story of one wrongful arrest had become a story of community, courage, and change, a reminder that justice wasn't just about fixing what was wrong, but about building something better together.